But the traditional idea is that the Israelites left Ramses and then traveled to the south to the Gulf of Aqaba or the other Gulf of Suez and crossed at one of these places. But when you begin to work with the details of the text, it turns out that probably it's a lot closer to Egypt than that. And so I sort of go along with the ideas of one of our colleagues, Jim Hoffmeyer, who's done a lot of work in the Egyptian Delta area, in this area where the Israelites traveled through as they were leaving Egypt. So when you do an analysis of the text and what it says, I think it's going to lead us to a place that's relatively close to where they left from Ramses, actually.
Right.
Because the route is not a straight line, okay? So when we read the text, well, there's one other factor that I should mention right away, and that is travel time. How far could the Israelites travel in one day with thousands upon thousands of people, their animals, their little kids,
Elderly.
their elderly?
Yeah.
It's not going to be very far. So
That makes a lot of sense.
some people would like to put Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. It just is too far away,
Right.
you know. So you have to keep these factors in mind. And when you look at the itinerary, now we have a very detailed itinerary from Ramses to Mount Sinai.
Yes.
Now when you deal with the after Mount Sinai, it gets, I haven't really analyzed that, but it's not so straightforward. But from what we have preserved for us as far as stopping places and so on, we can work out the pretty much the route and where they went. So if you look at the map that's up on the screen, you can see that Ramses is there on the east side of the delta, and we have a little dotted line going southeast to Tel El Maskuta. That's the ancient site of Succoth. That's the first stopping place mentioned. It might have taken a couple of days to get there, but it's a major stopping point. Now, I'm very familiar with Tel El Maskuta because I excavated there for 3 seasons. And we've made some interesting finds. But interesting discoveries there. Actually, some material from the Middle Bronze period, the time of the sojourn in Egypt, may be related to the Israelites, but nothing actually from the time of the journey, which would have been in the early Late Bronze period.
Okay.
Of course, 1446 BC. But we think Succoth is at Tel Maskuta because the name Succoth is preserved in the word Maskuta. We have Succoth with a prefixed name, which makes it a noun. So that seems to be a good candidate. And that's located in the Wadi Tumilat. It's an east-west route across the southern part of the delta. Originally, that was one of the branches of the Nile, and the Nile kept moving westward.
So Wadi is a dried up river.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that what the term means?
Yes, and there's a canal there that they use for irrigation. Then we read that they come to Etam, which means fortress, according to the text, at the edge of the wilderness. And there, we're told the Israelites turn, but we're not told if they turn north or if they turn south. Now that we've done a fair bit of archaeological work in Egypt, we realize that Etam was a border fortress because we are now at the eastern border of Egypt. And of course, the Israelites are trying to get out. The Egyptians, after the Hyksos episode, where these Canaanites came in and took over rule of the country for a period of time, they basically sealed up their eastern border, so people just couldn't wander back and forth. And so this was a difficulty facing the Israelites. They had to get out of the country, but how do they get through the defensive system that the Egyptians had set up? Not only fortresses, but canals, wide, deep canals all along the border.
And that would have been very difficult for them to traverse with family, animals, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. So they had to turn, and we believe from the evidence we have, they turned north. And the places that are mentioned, the campsite and so on, leads one to believe that they were up in the north. Baal Zephon, that means Baal of the North,
okay.
one of the stopping places. So we will now come to your answer to your question, where was the Red Sea crossing? Well, we talked in the last segment about the fact the Israelites could not travel very far in a day, on the order of maybe 6 miles a day with their families and flocks and herds and so on. So when we look at this route, we see that it would take them about a week's time to get to Etam, that place at the border there, and then probably turn north. The evidence seemed to suggest that. And then they only travel another 3 days. They reach the sea in 10 days, only 10 days, okay? Now, they made a bit of a circuitous route here, going southeast, then east, now north. But that seems to be what the text is saying, and we have quite a bit of detail given about where they camped at the sea. It mentions Migdol and Baal Zephon and the Pi-hahiroth, which means the mouth of the canal. So they were, near one of these canals that I mentioned before. But now they're sort of trapped. If you remember, Pharaoh changed his mind about letting the Israelites go.
Yes.
And after they left, he said, boy, we got to get these people back. We don't have our workforce here. And so Pharaoh got his army together, and he set out to catch up with the Israelites. So if you look at our map, you can see that from Ramses, if Pharaoh is just leaving, say, after a week or so after he decided he's going to chase the Israelites, he would simply go east, directly east from Ramses, and he would come to the place where many scholars believe the sea crossing took place. A good friend of mine has done a lot of research in this area. Jim Hoffmeyer, he was a friend of mine at the University of Toronto, and he's excavated in this very area. He's done a lot of work around an area referred to as the Bala Lake, and determining the extent of that lake and the depth of it and so on. And he concludes that this is the correct location for the sea crossing. Now, this might bother a lot of people because they might have in mind some monster body of water. Actually, it was a large body of water in antiquity, but it's not there today. The Suez Canal comes through here, and when they built that canal, it drained this particular lake. You can see remnants of it, particularly from a satellite photo, but even in the local area, you can find pockets of water. You still see the reeds going, incidentally. The Hebrew name is Yam Suf, which means sea of reeds. It doesn't say Red Sea in the Hebrew. It says Reed Sea. And so this appears to be the place, and Jim Hoffmeyer has determined it was a very large body of water. Satellite photo tells you that, actually. And it was very deep. And with Pharaoh now approaching with the army, they're backed up against this Yam Suf. And as I mentioned, they're trying to penetrate the border. fortresses, canals all the way along, so now they're trapped. Their backs are to the wall, so to speak. And it would take a miracle for them to get out of Egypt and to survive an attack from Pharaoh and his army. And that's exactly what God did. He parted the waters of this body of water, and they crossed over. And once they were on the other side, they were out of Egypt. They were into the so-called wilderness, Sinai area. And so they were sort of on their way once they had gotten through this. So that's a little bit of the geography of that situation there. And as I say, they reached that point in 10 days only, and then they continued their journey from there. Well, it was a large body of water, this Bala Lake.
Yes.
Jim Hoffmeyer estimates it probably was 30 feet deep. Now, it's not the Mediterranean,
right.
It's not the Gulf of Suez,
right.
But it's a body of water that was impenetrable for the Israelites. It formed part of the eastern border of Egypt, one of the barriers. There's several lakes along that eastern border.
Yes.
So between the lakes, there's very wide, deep canals the Egyptians dug periodically. There's fortresses and so on. So it was part of the border, actually, the eastern border of Egypt. And the Israelites needed a miracle. No matter where they crossed, they needed a miracle. And so it's at a place called Yam Suf. We know from Egyptian records, Bala Lake was referred to a number of times.
So it fits there?
As the Sea of Reeds.
Yes.
And so all the evidence comes together to suggest this particular place. And as you say, we have an idea in our mind, some monster body of water, but it doesn't matter how big it is. If it's part of the border and it's a barrier to the Israelites, they had to somehow penetrate it. And the only way would be for God to open up that water and allow them to cross. And the Bible's quite specific about it. God parted the water with a wall on the left and a wall on the right. It wasn't some wind blowing the water to one end of this little pond or something.
Yes, yes.
We do have a traditional site in the southern Sinai, which when you take a tour to Egypt, many times they will take you over there and let you climb up Mount Sinai, very high mountain, Jabal Musa is the Arabic name for it. But it just really does not meet the biblical requirements. We've talked about how far the Israelites could travel in a day, and being only about 6 miles. And you have to take into account they would stop for Shabbat, not travel on the seventh day. So that really limits the scope of where they could get to. Now, the Bible's very specific. It gives us some time indicators. And you can divide the journey actually into two parts. We read that it took them 30 days, 1 month, to reach the desert of Sin. That was like a halfway point. And we think we know where that is. There's a mountain called Sinai, which probably still retains that word sin, and there's a desert there. And then from the desert of Sin to Mount Sinai was another 30 days. So they reached Mount Sinai in just 60 days. So this location at the southern end of the Sinai is a bit of a stretch to reach it. They might be able to do it, but it's pretty well at the end of what you could do in 60 days. But a more important factor is that we learn from the biblical text when Moses was out with Jethro's flock, it's called the backside of the desert. You remember Moses now is living in Midian before the Exodus, and God appeared to Moses at the burning bush, which was at the mountain of God, Horeb. Well, that's Mount Sinai. And in fact, the Israelites return to Mount Horeb, to the mountain of God, for the Ten Commandments, and then it's called Mount Sinai. So there's several names given to that holy mountain. So if Moses was there pasturing the flocks of Jethro from Midian, Midian is way up at the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba, the Gulf of Eilat. That's a long ways from the southern Sinai. And so that would put it up closer to the north end of the Gulf of Eilat. And so that's an argument against the southern location. And really, the only argument supporting the southern location is tradition. And whose tradition is that? It's basically the Coptic Christians that were driven out of Egypt in the Roman period, persecuted, and they were driven out. So they settled in this area. And if you know anything about the Copts, you know that they love to have holy sites. The area up around the northern end of the Gulf of Eilat is a much more compelling location, and we have various lines of evidence that would suggest that that's the area. So if you lay out the itinerary, you'll find that to get from Ramses to this desert of Sin would take you 30 days, traveling about 6 miles a day. And then from that Mount Sin to a place called Jebel Kashem et Tarif, near the northern end of the Gulf of Eilat, is another 30 days. Now I should mention that myself and several colleagues from ABR actually traveled this route and measured the distances and looked at the water sources along the way and so on. And from the distances we measured, it fits exactly to be a place where the Israelites could travel to in 60 days. And so this is a very attractive candidate, and it fits the biblical account much better than the southern Sinai location.
I'm going to show where it is, the mountain that you've identified as part of the research. And I think what we'll do is mention the Trans-Sinai Highway, which runs past near that.
Yes. Well, when you become familiar with the Sinai Peninsula in antiquity, you learn that there are a limited number of trails, if you will, or roads that go through that area because you're limited by the water supply along the way. And so there are certain roads that have been developed. Scholars have investigated. They know pretty much where these roads went. And a major road was what I refer to as the Trans-Sinai Highway. Now that was the road actually from Egypt to Midian, to the north end of the Gulf of Eilat. So when Moses fled, that's probably how he ended up in Midian. He was trying to get as far away from Egypt as he could, and so he traveled east across the Sinai Peninsula, and he just ended up in Midian. Of course, he's not going to stop in the Sinai. That's a lousy place to stop. Once he got across the Sinai, he was pretty well free from the Egyptians, so he goes to Midian. Then, when he is out pasturing the flocks, he is on the far side of the desert. So it appears that he, again, traveled this Trans-Sinai Highway, and that's when God appeared to him at the burning bush. So he's still on that Trans-Sinai Highway. In fact, we read that he was at the mountain of God. He was at Mount Horeb. Now, we have a very interesting passage in Deuteronomy 1:2 dealing with the distance from the Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. And it says it takes 11 days to travel from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir road. Well, Kadesh Barnea is to the north. And it actually extended further south from Mount Sinai, but it was a north-south road. So the Bible really, we've mentioned there's a lot of candidates for Mount Sinai and Saudi Arabia and this place and that place, Mount St. Catherine's and so on. The Bible actually gives us the address. It's at the corner of the Trans-Sinai Highway and the Mount Seir Road. That's exactly where Jebel Keshemet Tarif is located. And so everything seems to come together. It's this being the proper location. Now, Moses, of course, returns to Egypt. How does he get there? Trans-Sinai Highway. When the Israelites leave Egypt, we cross the Yam Suf with them. Then they go south. We know for sure they went south. We know some of the locations. And then what road did they take? They took the Trans-Sinai Highway, because if you remember when they got to Mount Sinai, who comes out to meet Moses? Jethro, his wife, his kids. They're near Midian. You know, they're not down in southern Sinai.
Yeah, yep.
They're traveling the same road back and forth. That's where the holy mountain is.
When people hear you say highway, they're imagining a highway, but we're talking about a path, a road,
well-traveled,
people walking, carts, animals, all that.
And in an ancient world, there would have had to have been that through the Sinai, because there was trade that took place between Egypt and Canaan and all the way up into Asia.
Lots of trade.
So this makes a lot of sense.
These routes were well-traveled and well-marked, and so it was, even though Moses had never been there, when he fled, I'm going to go east, and this was the road you took.
Right. Yes.
Well, as opposed to wandering out into the desert just randomly, where he would have perished, it seems sense, even if he didn't know where he was going, that he would have followed a road that was well traveled, that where people were on, so it was, maybe he would have perceived it as being a little safer, perhaps.
Sure.
I guess we can't say it was well lit, though, can we?
Well, you get the idea when you read the account in Exodus. They're just wandering around. They're not wandering. These places are along a well-established route that people traveled all the time.
So the corner of the Mount Seir Road and the Trans-Sinai Highway is where you think, and in Midian, it's got to be in Midian, and where the evidence sort of comes together. And so this mountain, Jebel Keshemet Tarif, maybe you could give a taste of 30 seconds of a little bit of what's been found around it. And then we'll pick it up in the next segment.
Yes. We are quite familiar with this place because quite a bit of, I wouldn't say it's archaeological work, but exploration. Up on the top of the mountain, and when we were there, we got up on top and visited the area. Up on top, there are graves, schist graves, piles of stones. And on the top and also around the base, there are many animal figures made of stone pressed into the hard desert floor. Very strange groupings of stones to form rectangles, to form like a wall between the area where there's a lot of these stone foundations or enclosures and the mountain, almost like a barrier. You're not to go past this point, you know. And all kinds of indications that this was a special holy mountain, revered in antiquity, with the burials of important people. And these stone enclosures, whatever people used them for, that could be associated with the Israeli encampment there, could have some other cultic function. It's hard to say, but there's a lot of interesting material there that suggests this was a very special place in antiquity. No big city there, but people visited there quite often, probably because of its religious significance in antiquity.
We're going to show pictures to our audience, of the expedition that we did there about 10 or so years ago. So go ahead. Why don't you continue with that, please?
Yes. Well, I think we mentioned that it took the Israelites 60 days to get there, and we can pretty well map out the stopping points along the way, and the travel time that would take fits exactly to be able to reach this location in 60 days' time. Now, we also have this other very interesting passage in Deuteronomy 1:2 that talks about its 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. Now, Kadesh Barnea, of course, was a camping place for the Israelites for a long period of time. I think they spent most of their time in the Sinai at Kadesh Barnea. It's north of Mount Sinai, and the text says it takes 11 days. Well, there again, if you measure that distance, we weren't able to get up there when we visited Jebel Keshemet Tarif because it was an area not safe to travel in as it is today.
It's very common in the Sinai, security issues.
Yeah, near the border with Israel. So, but on the map you can see that it's about 75 miles. And so 11 days, that's roughly 7 miles a day easily within the capability of Israelites with all of their families and so on to get up there. So that's a very important point in helping us locate where Mount Sinai should be. It's got to be an 11-day journey from Kadesh Barnea. Now, there's some that would question the traditional location, but this one that's accepted by most scholars fits very nicely with Mount Sinai here at Jebel Keshemet Tarif. It's a relatively low mountain. Hopefully we can get a picture up there so folks can look at it. It takes maybe 30 minutes to climb up to the top. And I think that, again, fits with what we read in the Bible.